Just make sure the recording's on. Okay. Um, this is the end of the historical part of the course. And we're going to go on next week to literature. I'll speak more about at the end, and then to the art and the movies and so on. We didn't see all of Lawrence of Arabia. I told you it's a very long movie. But if you're interested in seeing it, you can see it for free on YouTube. You can just Google it on YouTube and see as much of it or the end of it or whatever you want. To kill any suspense, the forces of Sharif Ben Ali, Ibn Ali, actually make it across the desert with Lawrence and end up in the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the southernmost point of what's today Israel, then Palestine, head up north and encounter the Ottoman Turks. And of course, the Ottoman Turks were defeated. And I would say it has a happy ending, but it doesn't, because that Arab revolt did not provide the Arabs with the British promised them, not surprisingly. They didn't get all of the independent nations that they were promised, and they didn't get the sovereignty that they were offered, even though they sacrificed many of their tribal members to go along with Lawrence of Arabia in this Arab revolt within World War I. All right, now this brings us to the end of World War I. And what we're going to talk about and we're going to see today is the following. We're going to start with a short documentary that talks about the final battle, really, and the final days of the First World War. And then after we see this documentary, we're going to talk about the Versailles Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. Those are very, very important, very significant events at the end of the war. There were many treaties that ended World War I, but the Treaty of Versailles is the most significant because that's the one that ultimately ended the war against Germany. And the Germany on one side, the Allies on the other, the French, the British, and the Americans, and the Italians. There were separate treaties that ended the war with Hungary, because now it was no longer Austria-Hungary, the empire was split. So Austria had one treaty, the Hungarians, the Treaty of Trianon ended that, and assorted other treaties along the way. I mean, because the Turks, actually, till they signed a treaty, it was quite a few years later. So there were various means by which World War I ended. But again, Versailles was the most important because of the provisions of that treaty vis-a-vis Germany and the consequences moving forward with respect to Germany in post-World War I, leading up to Germany in World War II. And there's a connection. So we're going to start with that documentary in a moment or two. Then we'll talk about the Treaty of Versailles. Then we'll talk about President Wilson's 14 points, because that was the American response in part to World War I. And I've posted those 14 points, so you can either read along or read them after. You will find them on the Blackboard tab under Documents. Okay, so that's where we're going. So we're going to start now with the this brief documentary on the end of World War I, and it's going to talk about many of the provisions of the Versailles Treaty.
What can I say about this week? This week, the war ends. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, what was left of the Austro-Hungarian Empire signed an armistice, leaving Germany as the last man standing of the Central Powers. The Allies advanced all week in the west and cut the Germans' last lateral railway line there. A naval mutiny at Kiel has turned into a full-blown German revolution. German delegates have gone to France to hopefully sign an armistice of their own. I mean, you really can't fight the whole world. On the 9th, Romania gave an ultimatum to Field Marshal August von Mackensen to remove all German troops from Romania within 24 hours. On the 10th, Romania again takes up arms against the invaders. But the German leadership had higher priorities. The morning of the 9th, as the week began, German armistice negotiators reached Compiègne Forest in France, while at Spa, the Kaiser tried to figure out his future. He met Admiral von Hintze at 11 a.m. and said that while he might no longer have control of the Navy,
By the way,
he has
Spa
the
is in
army, and he
Belgium.
can lead that into Germany, put down the revolution. There were now 11 German cities flying the red Soviet flag, and 5 of those were major ports. The Kaiser asked Quartermaster General Wilhelm Groener for his opinion. Groener said no military operations either within or outside Germany could succeed. The revolutionaries controlled the rail centers, and a lot of soldiers had joined the revolution anyhow. Heck, Aachen, the nearest German city, just over 30 kilometers away from Spa, was under rebel control, as was Verviers, a German-occupied Belgian town just 15 kilometers away. The army would not fight, and there were no reserves. The Kaiser did not really seem to understand and first suggested military action against Verviers and Aachen. After that, he floated the idea of him staying at Spa until after the armistice was signed and then returning to Berlin at the head of his mighty army. Groener said, "The army will march home in peace and order under its leaders and commanding generals, but not under the command of your majesty, for it no longer stands behind your majesty." When the Kaiser pointed out that his senior generals took an oath of personal loyalty to him, Groener said, "Today, oaths of loyalty have no substance." Right then, a telegram was brought in from the Berlin commander that read, "All troops deserted, completely out of hand." Telegrams kept coming in all afternoon that were basically the same thing or worse. One said that the Spartacists under Karl Liebknecht had taken control of the Imperial Palace and from there proclaimed a German Soviet Republic. And responding to that, a socialist leader named Philipp Scheidemann had proclaimed a socialist republic from the Reichstag. Chancellor Max von Baden, trying desperately to preserve the monarchy, announced, falsely, that Wilhelm had abdicated and a regency council would be set up. He then resigned the chancellorship and gave it over to Friedrich Ebert, a social democrat leader. The roads leading back to Germany were held by revolutionaries, and even at Spa, soldiers were setting up a Soviet. By 5 p.m., the Kaiser decided he would leave for the Netherlands and exile the next morning. Meanwhile, in Compiègne, Matthias Erzberger tried to explain the extent of revolutionary activity and the threat of Bolshevism engulfing Central Europe and used that to try and get more lenient armistice terms from the Allies. No dice. Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch wouldn't have it. Erzberger asked for a ceasefire as long as negotiations were in progress. No dice. Foch will not cease hostilities until an armistice is signed. Interesting quote here from Martin Gilbert. The fighting therefore went on, but Germany could no longer influence the outcome of the negotiations by its actions on the battlefield. In the 100 days since the Allied offensive had opened at the beginning of August, Germany's power had been broken not by dissent or revolution behind the lines, or by political intrigue, as later nationalist and Nazi politicians were to claim, but by the military superiority of the Allied armies. The combined total of 363,000 prisoners and 6,400 guns constituted a quarter of the German army in the field and 1/2 of all of its guns. The war-making power of Germany, even to defend its borders, was within a few days of collapse. But the war was still active in the field. On the 9th, the Americans advanced into Lorraine. On the 10th, the Canadians entered Mons, where 4 years ago the British Expeditionary Force had first seen action. That day, the British minesweeper Ascot was torpedoed by a German submarine. 53 drowned. Also that day, the Kaiser left Spa for the Netherlands. He did not take the train through Liège nor a car dead straight there through German territory, but instead went by car through back roads after being warned that the army in Liège may be mutinous, as people would within Germany. The night of the 10th, news reached Compiègne from Berlin that the German government had accepted armistice terms. Once signed, Germany would immediately evacuate Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and Alsace-Lorraine, and everyone from those places who had been imprisoned or deported would be immediately returned home. Germany would surrender 2,000 planes, 5,000 artillery pieces, and 30,000 machine guns. The Allies would occupy, and German troops would evacuate, Western Germany up to the left bank of the Rhine, and the Allies would take 3 bridges across it: Mainz, Koblenz, and Köln. Germany had 36 days to deliver 10,000 trucks, 5,000 train engines, and 150,000 train cars to the Allies. All the German troops holding the captured territory in the east must return to within Germany's 1914 pre-war borders. Black Sea ports must be evacuated. They asked for the Germans to hand over 160 submarines, but this caused a technical issue as the Germans did not have 160 submarines. So they changed it to all submarines must be handed over, as well as 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 8 light cruisers, and 50 destroyers. Germany will be required to pay reparations for damages done in Belgium and northern France. The trains carrying the negotiators pulled up in a siding in Compiègne Forest, not too far from Rétonde on the Ain River. They drew up in parallel 100 meters apart. The main German car had once belonged to French Empress Eugénie, Napoleon III's consort, but they met in Foch's car, a dining car wagon 2419D. There, Ferdinand Foch, Maxime Weygand, Vice Admiral Rosslyn Weems, Rear Admiral George Hope, and Captain Jack Marriott met Matthias Erzberger, Ernst von Sellog, Count Alfred von Oberndorf, and Detlev von Winterfeld. In the final discussion, Erzberger got the concession that Germany would surrender only 25,000 machine guns, 1,700 planes, and only 5,000 trucks. This was designed to have something left to combat internal chaos. The armistice was signed at 5:10 a.m. on the morning of November 11th. Foch telegraphed the news to the Allied commanders that hostilities on the front, the whole front, will cease at 11 a.m. The war in the field, the World War, will be over. Fighting did continue all morning. Even after getting the news of the signing early in the morning, for example, the American Army ordered the fight to continue. If you think those soldiers who died in those last few hours died needlessly, you are not alone, for that order provoked a congressional investigation. It is hard to say who was the final soldier to die in the active war. Just east of Mons, Canadian Private George Price was killed by a sniper at 10:58. John Buchan, the novelist who would later serve as Governor General of Canada, wrote, "At 2 minutes to 11, opposite the South African Brigade, the German machine gunner, after firing off a belt without pause, was seen to stand up beside his weapon, take off his helmet, bow, and then slowly walk to the rear. With the stroke of 11, there came a second of expectant silence, and then a curious rippling sound, which observers far behind the front likened to the noise of a light wind. It was the sound of men cheering from the Vosges to the sea." In cities around the world, hundreds of millions of people soon flooded the streets to celebrate. Winston Churchill would ask a decade later, "Who shall mock or begrudge these overpowering entrancements? Every Allied nation shared them." These hours were brief, their memory fleeting. They passed as suddenly as they had begun. Too much blood had been spilt. Too much life essence had been consumed. The gaps in every home were too wide and empty. The shock of an awakening and the sense of disillusion followed swiftly upon the poor rejoicings with which hundreds of millions saluted the achievement of their heart's desire. There still remained the satisfactions of safety assured, of peace restored, of honor preserved, of the comforts of fruitful industry, of the homecoming of the soldiers, but these were in the background. and with them all were mingled the ache for those who would never come home. Many of you have followed this channel for several years, some from the beginning, and I thank all of you, however long you've been fans, for your support. You will know this project would have been impossible without it. This will be the last regular episode of the series.
Wow.
By that, I mean the last episode that follows the events of the war in real time 100 years later. There will be a series of epilogues starting Thursday that talk about what came after this day. And there are several Monday specials yet to come as well. But the war is over. This has been, without question, the greatest, most challenging, and most fun thing I have ever done in my life, researching, writing, and presenting the whole.
Okay, so the war ended, as is popularly noted, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. That is November 11th. Actually, it was the 11th hour depending where you were, because obviously it was a world war, it spanned all these different time zones. But it's a convenient and a cute way of summarizing that end as being the 11th hour, because that's actually about the time the armistice was signed, of the 11th day, November 11th of the 11th month. Couple of points that probably we'll talk about later on also. Basically what he's discussed and summarized here was the final hurrah, if you will, of the German army, which was, as he pointed out, mutinous. German soldiers weren't fighting anymore, they'd had it. In fact, there was, in a number of places, as he pointed out, a revolution, a communist revolution, including amongst the sailors in the port of Kiel, K-I-E-L, it's northern Germany. And the Kiel Canal, you might remember from one of the previous documentaries, was a port in northern Germany that had been expanded by the Kaiser with the intention of increasing the size and power of the German Navy. In Kiel, the sailors were told to continue fighting. They weren't about to do that. It was over, and they knew it, and they were not going to be cannon fodder. So they staged a revolution and established a Soviet. The Soviet, the Soviet Union was communist Russia. A Soviet is the Russian word for a workers' council. So the workers would control and make the decisions and the policy and so on. So Kiel was one of those cities that, in response to the end of the First World War, but the fact that they were still not being released, they staged a revolution and set up a Soviet-style communist sailor and soldiers Soviet council. In Berlin, they showed what happened in Berlin with Karl Liebknecht. It was Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, two very interesting figures who headed the Spartacus Bund, the Spartacus Union, which was a communist party in Berlin. And briefly, Karl Liebknecht actually, with his troops, went into the palace of the Kaiser and took over. In fact, he slept in the Kaiser's bed for a couple of nights before they were chased out. And this is true in Bavaria, in Munich, also, communist government that was set up at the end of World War I in Germany as a response to the anger and bitterness of the Germans with respect to what the government had done in involving them in this 4-year war, lying to them all the way, making all kinds of promises, and then everything, of course, was a disaster. So the end result of World War I was mass anger, bitterness, demonstrations, communist governments, and everything else in Germany. The Kaiser, they mentioned, was trying to direct this whole thing from his command post in Spa, S-P-A. Now we know, spa is the general term for any kind of a health resort. The original spa, that was the original spa. It's a town in Belgium, just as interesting digression. I have a picture of my great-grandfather. Of course, I didn't know him, but there's my great-grandfather on vacation in Spa. He lived in Belgium, and he was on holiday. I'm not sure what year this was. It was obviously after World War One, but Spa is the place where all these resorts get their name from. Now, so from my train of thought. The Kaiser. So the Kaiser tried. I mean, he said, well, I still have the army behind me. No, you don't have the army behind you anymore. And the Navy has rebelled and you've got nothing and there's no place to go back to. So the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, never went back to Germany. He went from Spa in Belgium across the border to Holland, and he spent the rest of his life in exile in Holland. Just as an interesting sort of side point, he actually lived long enough to see Hitler become the Chancellor of Germany and the Nazis take over. He actually supported Hitler and the Nazis. Why? Remember, the Kaiser was never the sharpest tool in the shed, wasn't the smartest guy around ever. He figured that Hitler would restore Germany to its pre-World War I status as an empire, and he would come back as the emperor. Incredibly stupid. True, Hitler had his own, the Nazi government was known as the Third Reich, the Third Empire. There was the empire of Wilhelm I after Germany became unified and became an empire in 1871. Then there was the empire of his grandson, Wilhelm II. Well, that collapsed after World War I. But the Nazis didn't intend to bring back the monarchy. No one was going to replace or compete with Hitler. The Third Reich, the Third German Empire, was the Nazi Empire, which they called das Tausendjährige Reich, the third 1,000-year Reich. In the Nazi imagination and mythology and everything else, they said this is the empire that's going to last for 1,000 years. It didn't last for about 12 years. But the Kaiser was dead wrong. Hitler was not going to invite him back to take the throne again. And so he died in exile in Holland. Okay, so that was basically the end of the German war after World War I. That was the end of the German Reich, the German Empire. And some of the matters that he spoke about with respect to disarmament and so on, reparations, these are all part of what became known as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was the culmination of the Versailles Conference. The Versailles Conference was a meeting of the Allies to determine the status of Germany after its defeat in World War I. The only thing that took place actually in Versailles, in the palace, was the signing of the treaty. All of the discussions leading up to that and deciding what the provisions of the treaty were going to be, that was all decided elsewhere in Paris, in the defense ministry. It was only in the Versailles Palace that the treaty was actually signed. There's a reason for that. Everything was symbolic. But it was maybe a misplaced decision. What happened? We have to go back. We spoke all the way in the beginning of the course about the different causes that led to World War I. One of them, a big one, was the emergence of Germany as a major power right in the middle of Europe, geographically, a threat to France on one side, Russia on the other side. The German arms buildup was a threat to the balance of power and so on. So what does this have to do with signing a treaty in the Versailles Palace? Well, what happened was in 1871, remember, after Germany was victorious in its third war under Bismarck, the first one against Denmark, the second one against Austria, the third one against France, then Germany emerged as an empire, and all the German-speaking dukedoms and provinces and princedoms and kingdoms, they all became one German empire. And that German empire was declared in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles Palace. This is 1871. The French were defeated, and on French soil, in Versailles Palace, this huge, phenomenal palace built by Louis XIV, in the Hall of Mirrors, which is one of the most extraordinary rooms you'll ever see in your life, the Germans declared the German Empire, made the French sign the document indicating French defeat by Germany. It also meant that France had to give up the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine that bordered Germany. And now the tables have been turned. Now the French, together with the Allies, are victorious, and the Germans have been defeated. So to rub the Germans' faces in the whole thing, they made them come to Versailles Palace in the same room in which the French had to sign the Articles of Defeat in 1871. Now the tables are turned, as I said, and the Germans have to sign the treaty ending World War I as a defeated nation in that very same room. But that wasn't all. They made the German delegation come to Versailles Palace by train, not just any train, a very intentionally slow-moving train, so that the German delegation could see all of the damage that resulted from World War I. And this treaty, we'll talk about it, specifically in Article 232, blamed Germany alone for World War I and everything that came out of it, which was actually not accurate and not totally fair, but didn't matter. You know, they say in French, la vengeance est un plat que se mange à froid. Vengeance is a dish best served cold. So between 1871 and 1918, a lot of time for the dish to turn cold. And now the vengeance was sweeter. Or as the Kennedys were fond of saying, don't get angry, get even. So now, shoes on the other foot, and now the Germans are going to be humiliated. First, they had to take the slow train to Paris, to Versailles, on the outskirts of Paris, and look at all the damage that resulted from the 4-year war. They got to Versailles Palace with their delegation and expected to be seated around a round table to discuss the provisions of this treaty. No. They were forced, the German delegation, to wait outside until everyone else, including the reporters, were seated, and then the Germans were allowed in. It's humiliation number 2. And then when they got there, they thought they were going to be negotiating a treaty. No, the treaty was already written. The Germans had to sign it. We'll see what, you know, the reaction to that was. It was not positive, not even totally amongst the Germans, but this was not a meeting to discuss the wording of the treaty. Treaty had already been written. It had been written in a conference that had preceded the signing, and the Germans had no input. So the Germans referred to the Treaty of Versailles, not as a treaty, but as ein Diktat, D-I-K-T-A-T, and as the word in German implies, it was dictated to them, it was shoved down their throat. It wasn't something that was the result of negotiations or any kind of give and take between the parties. So it started out in a very negative way, certainly vis-a-vis the Germans. And now we'll talk about what was in that treaty, which made things even worse. And obviously there was a lingering anger, animosity, a real hatred. And that hatred, that sense of being totally degraded, became one of the main planks in the emerging Nazi movement and the nationalist movements in Germany after World War I. And of course, that culminated, obviously, in the Nazi government of Germany, 1932-33, which always pointed back towards what had happened in 1918 to stir up the nationalist emotions of the German people. As I said, there were many treaties that ended World War I. The Treaty of Versailles is the most important. And interestingly, what day was that treaty signed? It was signed on June 28th, 1919. Think back to the very beginning of the class. What's the significance of June 28th? June 28th was the day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, when they were visiting and looking over the troop movements of the Austro-Hungarian army. So the day that this Diktat, according to the Germans, or the Treaty of Versailles, according to everyone else, the day it was signed was exactly the 5th anniversary of the, signed in 1919, right? So it was the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. The different countries that were part of the Central Powers signed separate treaties at various points later on, except the Austrians, as they pointed out, signed before the Germans. So they were out of the war. Amongst the provisions of the treaty was the infamous Guild Clause. And I think I have the text of that somewhere. But basically, the Guild Clause makes Germany solely and uniquely responsible for the war, for the incredible numbers of dead, injured, and so on, and for the property damage and destruction that came out of the war as well. I think I have that text somewhere. If I don't find it now, I'll find it at some point, right? But that was issue number 1, the Guild Clause. That was Article 231. Then came the issue of reparations. It was a 4-year war. In 4 years, the youth of these countries was cut down. The economies were destroyed. Industries had to do what they could for the war effort, but could not be engaged in production of items that were basically consumer items. So everything was really not just ended, but severely impacted going forward. What happened? Nations on the winning side, especially the French, wanted to be compensated for that. And so there was a provision in the Versailles Treaty for reparations. And the reparations amounted to, in current US dollars, 442 billion, with a B, 442 billion US dollars by today's today's evaluation, or 284 billion pounds sterling, according to the British monetary system, and so on. It was a huge debt and burden on Germany. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who was British and one of the British participants, delegates to the conference, said himself, "This is absolute insanity. It's a Carthaginian peace." What does that mean? If you know anything about the ancient history and the Greek Empire, the Greeks fought the Carthaginians. Carthage is the equivalent of it's basically, I think, Algeria, Northern Africa. And the Greeks had a particular policy regarding defeated nations. It was a scorched earth policy. Literally, what they did is, it wasn't enough to defeat the Carthaginians. They set their entire land on fire and burnt it totally so that they could not raise crops. Total and brutal, massacre during and after that Carthaginian war. Those were the Punic Wars. And basically, that's what John Maynard Keynes is saying that the British were doing to the Germans after World War I. So that economic burden was also overwhelming and unsustainable for the Germans. Now, in years subsequent, there were arrangements made to lessen the burden of the reparations on the Germans. There's a Dawes Plan, we'll speak about other plans that lightened the burden of German obligation to pay all of this money, because it was, as was pointed out by not just Keynes, but also by the British Prime Minister, you're going to wreck the German economy totally, and there are trading partners, and you have to think ahead. If you wipe them out economically and totally burden them with this obligation to pay all this money, they're not going to be able to participate in world trade, and that's not going to help us, because we were trading partners, and hopefully we'll be trading partners again. It's not a really great idea. So there were adjustments made, but in the meantime, the Germans were forced to pay huge money. What was the result of that? The period after World War I in Germany was known as the Weimar Republic. It was the first attempt by the Germans to actually have a democratic Republican form of government with a constitution, a a bicameral legislature like we have. We have a Congress and a Senate. They had a Reichstag and a Reichsrat. All of the provisions of the Constitution of the Weimar Republic basically were kind of dictated by the United States in the hope of forming a democratic, with a small d, republic with a capital R, sort of government. But that was undermined in good part by the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, including the reparation provision, all the money the Germans had to pay. After all, where was the money supposed to come from, right? The German economics has been wrecked during World War I. Industry had been destroyed. So you're required and forced to pay all of the money. Where's the money going to come from? Well, when you and I spend more than we should, and the American Express bill comes in, we got to come up with the money somehow or other. But when you're a government, you have another option. What's the other option? Print more money. So that's what the German government had no choice. They had to make these payments. Where's the money going to come from? Just print more money. What happens when you keep printing more money? Money becomes worthless. So what happened was, as a result of the, great burden of reparations that were forced by the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar government had no other choice but to keep printing money to pay. The money became totally worthless. So what happened? The hyperinflation that ensued because of this totally not only wiped out the German economy during the Weimar Republic, but it destroyed the lives of Germans. How? Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples, and then a really interesting, there are many stories, but this one in particular that I find sort of very telling. What happened? When you have a hyperinflation and money becomes absolutely worthless, everything becomes much, much more expensive because the money isn't worth anything. So you just charge more and more money, which in the case of Germany was ludicrous because the inflation wasn't something that happened over a short period of time. It was going on by the hour. So for example, I'll give you two examples. One, my grandmother told me, my family comes from Berlin, from Germany, from Berlin. And in those days, even a middle-class person had help in the house. It wasn't the unusual thing. So my grandmother had a number of, I guess, a housekeeper. There was someone who was a governess for the girl. My mother had two sisters, so there was someone hired for that. In the middle of this hyperinflation, these individuals who worked for my grandmother and my grandfather, at some point didn't even want to be paid because the money was worthless. What they wanted, rather, was to be paid in bread, loaves of bread or other food, so that they knew they could put something on the table, whereas the money, by the time they walked out, took the money at the end of the day and walked out, it was worthless. It's a famous story that's told, it's a true story. Because the inflation rate due to this was so great, as I said, by the hour, would cost, let's say, 100 Reichsmark at 10 o'clock could cost 1,000 or 10,000 by 11 o'clock. To tell the story of a bread line, there was a long line when around the block, near some bakery or other, people wanted to buy bread. And they came with huge amounts of paper money, knowing that by the time they got into the store, after waiting in line, the price of the bread was going to be many, many times what they thought it was going to be when they first started. So there was one gentleman who came with a wheelbarrow full of money, piled to the top, piled all the way up, because he had no idea how much it was going to cost a loaf of bread. So he took everything he had, put it in the wheelbarrow, and stood on line. At some point, he had to leave the line, and he asked the person behind, "Would you please watch my wheelbarrow? I'll be back in a few moments," or whatever. So he left, and when he came back, all of the money was piled up on the ground, but someone stole the wheelbarrow. Obviously, the wheelbarrow was worth something, the money not. So that hyperinflation that was part of German life from 1920 till around 1925, when the German economy turned around finally, that was how people had to live. If they had any money saved, it was gone because it was worthless. And any money that came in, if they could find a job, because that also led to an incredible unemployment rate, also worthless. Their life savings wiped out. I mean, all of that economically was a result of that provision in the Treaty of Versailles that heavily punished the Germans for the war, and therefore basically wiped out their post-World War I economy. There were other plans, as I said, that came along. It was the Dawes Plan. Charles Dawes was an American banker. There was the Young Plan. There were different plans to try and postpone the payments so the Germans could breathe, so they could try and put themselves back together. The truth is, Germany never paid the full amount that was levied against them in the reparation clause in the treaty. Other things came along, other conferences, other attempts to help the Germans out, other accommodations. Germans never paid the full amount of reparation that was set in the Treaty of Versailles. But for the immediate years after, it caused enough of a disaster for the German economy that that lingering memory was grasped by the extreme right-wing nationalist Nazi parties, to justify their platform and to call for ultimate revenge. It wasn't only, by the way, the right wing, it was also the left wing, the communists. The communists said, we see all of this disaster, all of the destruction, all of the suffering, all of that comes out of capitalism. Their platform or their claim was that capitalism led to World War I, capitalism, imperialism, and so on, and therefore it's the capitalist system that's at fault. So the communists made their claim after World War I that they should be the replacement ideology. right? And in Italy, it was fascism, and so on. All of the isms that have defined the 20th century basically came out of World War I and its defeat and its consequences. Okay, so that's that's the economic issue that was basically a very important part of the treaty and its aftermath. What did these different countries want? We already, by the way, might as well eliminate it again. Russia is out of the picture. Remember, they had their little revolution in 1917. They signed a treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that took them out of the war. That treaty was between Russia and Germany, by the way. It's 1917. And according to that treaty, and it does actually have a bearing on Versailles, because in that treaty, the Germans brutalized the Russians. The Russians had to give up huge areas of their nation, of their empire. And what that meant was they lost 1.3 million square miles of what was previous to the Russian Empire, and all of the different people in that 1.3 million square miles. And there were other sanctions levied by the Germans, because in the Eastern Front, they were the victors at that point. You know, they had defeated the Russians. So the brutality of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in part, was, you know, it was the payback time in the Treaty of Versailles, which made it a little bit difficult for the Germans to scream too much. They did the same thing when they brutalized the Russians. But the Russians are out, right? Who's left? The United States, the French, the British, the Italians, right, basically. And they're the parties who were made up the Allied contingent in the Conference of Versailles and then the Treaty of Versailles. What did the United States want? The United States then had a president by the name of Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat, and a very principled man with a very strong religious belief system. As I mentioned earlier on, his father was a Methodist minister, and so on. He was an academic. He was a professor of history at Princeton, and then he was the president of Princeton University. What did he want? Okay, what he wanted was a solution. He wanted an end without victory. He didn't want to rub the face of the Germans in this, even though he hated the Germans, but he didn't want it to be an opportunity to humiliate and degrade the Germans. He wanted a solution to this war that would preclude any other further wars. It's not the way it turned out exactly. But what he wanted was a solution that would at least prevent a war and avoid all of the causes that led to World War I. And so he came up with what he called the 14 points. And as I said earlier on, they've been posted on Blackboard. You can look at them either now or later on. These 14 points were Wilson's program or his vision of a world at peace. He declared these on January 8th of 1918, and these proposals became part of what was ultimately the Treaty of Versailles. I'll read some of them to you, and you'll see what exactly Wilson had in mind. As it turns out, Wilson's fellow Americans, that is to say the legislature, the Congress, didn't go along with it, sadly, right? But this is what he had in mind in these separate ideas that were essential to the nature of post-World War I settlement. One, open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings. What is that all about? Remember, one of the causes of World War I was the alliance system, the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente, and so on. The three Kaisers, three emperors agreement earlier on. These were agreements made between the different nations, these were empires, privately, secretly. And they, remember, provided that if any one of these three nations was attacked by an outside country, the other two would join in fighting off the threat from this outside nation, which was a guarantee for war, because the way things worked in Europe, at least one of these countries was going to have a conflict, and therefore the other two would be drawn in. So that already made for a much wider confrontation. And they were secret. Remember the Sykes-Picot Agreement, right? That was an agreement originally between France, Britain, and Russia. Russia was out, but still between France and Britain to cut up the entire Ottoman Empire, or what was left of it, when the war ended, and divvy it up between Britain and France, depending upon security and strategic considerations and oil, lands, and so on. It's a private agreement. So according to number 1 of the 14 points, couldn't do this anymore. Everything needed to be out in the open. No secret arrangements between nations. 2, absolute freedom of navigation of the seas. Obviously, where did that come from? Well, remember, one of the reasons that the United States entered the war was because of unrestricted submarine warfare on the part of the Germans. According to point 2, there had to be absolute freedom of navigation. You didn't have to worry about sending commercial or other passenger vessels or anything else across the ocean and fear that there was going to be bombed, or blown up or torpedoed by a German U-boat, right? So that was part 2, absolute freedom of navigation. Countries did not have to any longer be concerned about the free passage of their vessels, which was also a result of the blockade, right? The British blockaded German ports earlier in World War I to break off the food supply and starve the Germans into submission. The Germans responded by using submarine warfare to blow out British and then ultimately French and American and other vessels from the waters. So absolute freedom of navigation was point 2. 3, removal of all economic barriers and establishment of equality of trade conditions, right? Because there had to be free trade. In order to get the world going again, there had to be an understanding about how trade between nations would be carried out. 4, adequate guarantees taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. No more arms race. No more crazy building up of stockpiles and poison gas and naval vessels and so on and so forth. There had to be a limit, and the limit would be consistent with what was absolutely necessary to provide national security. By the way, it was undermined, and it was there was a run around this thing. What happened was the Germans, as you'll see, was severely limited in the size of an army they could have and the number of armaments they could produce. So what they did was, and this is one of the great ironies also, they used the Spanish Civil War as an opportunity to test their airplanes and aircraft in that war, because it was not on German land anymore. So they could get away with it as not being a violation. And did they keep building new and better armaments? Yes, they did. And you know where they did that? In the Soviet Union and Soviet Russia. Because the Soviets were more interested in getting hard currency than in abiding by the terms of the 14 points. And the Germans took advantage of this and used Russia as a means of producing more and more armaments. The irony being that one of the claims of Hitler leading up to World War II was got to get rid of the Russians and the Bolsheviks. They're a threat. Yeah, but they used them. The Germans used them, just like they used them in World War I in that sealed train where they got Vladimir Lenin back to Russia to start a revolution. A lot of two-faced behavior. Right? Next, a free, open mind, and absolute impartial judgment of colonial claims. One of the issues that bred World War I was nationalism, colonialism. Remember, the whole war began really in the Balkans because of the desire to have freedom from the colonial control of Austria-Hungary, right? Bosnia and Herzegovina. So one of the provisions that Wilson put into the 14 points was no more colonial claims. People and nations are entitled to their sovereignty and their freedom. And that led to a number of new nations emerging, including Czechoslovakia and others. Next, the evacuation of all Russian territory, right? Remember the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk? The Germans brutalized the Russians to end the Eastern Front War, and they basically took over 1.3 million square miles of Russia. Russia will now be made whole again. 7, very important, Belgium. It says Belgium, the whole world would agree, must be evacuated and restored. Remember, Belgium was one of the first victims, really the first victim of German aggression because of the von Schlieffen Plan, and German army marched right through in 1914 and occupied, brutalized, and raped Belgium. Now, said Wilson, everyone's going to agree that the Belgians have to be made whole, get back all of their land, and have the invader, the Germans, removed, right? And be compensated for the damage. Next, all French territory should be freed. And what did that mean? Alsace-Lorraine. Remember, after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, the Germans occupied Alsace-Lorraine, which were French provinces. Now, France gets them back. Number 9, adjustment of frontiers of Italy. The Italians were done a number on. They were promised all kinds of things because after all, the Italians are part of the Triple Alliance. They should have been fighting with the Germans and the Austrians, but they opted to go to the other side, to the Allies, because they were promised certain areas in the Tyrolean Alps and so on, and they didn't get all of the land that they were promised, and they were pretty much ignored during the whole Versailles Conference and treaty signing. They was really embarrassed by the fact that they were sort of pushed aside. But they had claims as well. The people, number 10, the people of Austria-Hungary, whose place among nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity of autonomous development. In other words, what? It's no longer Austria-Hungary. Hungary is now a separate country. Austria is a separate country, but Austria cannot be allied with Germany because after World War I, everyone saw the risk of bringing those two entities together. Ironically, what happened in 1938, the Anschluss, Germany annexed Austria, and that preceded by 1 year the beginning of World War II. But after World War I, the idea was to make sure that Austria was separate, distinct, sovereign, and independent of Germany. Then spoke about Romania, Serbia, and so on. Again, they should be given their autonomy. Then 12 Turkish portions of the present Ottoman Empire would be given their sovereignty, would be divided up into separate nations. And 13, very important, an independent Polish state would be erected. You know, Poland had a very unfortunate history. My doctoral advisor was Polish, and he always used to tell me, you know, if it weren't for the Germans and the Russians and the Austrians, the Poles wouldn't even know who they are. Because in the course of Polish history, Poland was always being divided up or occupied by somebody. And so now Poland would be guaranteed its autonomy, and the Polish corridor would be established. The Polish corridor was a strip of land that allowed Poland to have access to a waterway instead of being landlocked. So for a while, there was now the independent country of Poland. Way back when, in the Middle Ages, there was the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania. That was many hundreds of years before, but after that, it was downhill for Poland. It was divided up between Russia, divided up Austria. Part of it was part of Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on and so forth. And part of it was occupied by Germany. After World War I, Poland was guaranteed its autonomy. But that wasn't the end for Polish history. You know why? In 1939, on September 1st of 1939, the German army crossed the border and occupied Poland. When Germany occupied Poland in 1939, that brought in other countries, the French, the British, and so on, to protect Polish sovereignty and to free Poland from the grasp of Hitler's Germany. In the beginning, Germany and Russia, at the beginning of World War II, had an agreement, right? They signed a pact. And the Russians agreed that they would let the Germans occupy one part of Poland, and in exchange, the Russians would occupy another part of Poland. So Poland in World War II, in the beginning, was divided between Russia and Germany. Ultimately, the Russians in 1941 invaded Russia, and suddenly they weren't partners anymore. They weren't allies, and the Russians now joined the Allies, the United States, the French, and the British. What was the irony regarding Poland? When World War II finally ended in 1945, what was the fate of Poland? Poland's now behind the Iron Curtain and is occupied by Russia. So the war began in 1939 with the occupation of Poland by Germany and Russia, and the Allies came in to free Poland. But now, by the end of the war, Russia was on the side of the Allies, and the Iron Curtain came up, and Eastern Europe was now behind the Iron Curtain and under the control of the Soviet Union, and so Poland wasn't free anymore. It was now a communist country dominated by Russia. And until 1989, it began first with the Solidarity movement in Poland, seeking its independence and freedom for Russia. And then ultimately in 1989, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in East Germany and then the rest of Eastern Europe, finally Poland had its independence. But that took until 1989. Very unfortunate. But at least at the end of World War I, there was a hope that Poland would have some sort of independence and sovereignty. And then most important was number 14. And number 14 is the General Association of Nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity. What was that all about? It was for the establishment of the League of Nations. League of Nations in President Wilson's idealistic mind would be the forum for all nations to work out their controversies and conflicts and everything else without having to go to the battlefield and fight it out. Which country did not join the League of Nations or sign on to the 14 points? The United States. And poor President Wilson, who was desperate to have this success, this was his raison d'etre, this was his cause célèbre, this was everything he wanted in life. He had to travel from one side of the United States to the other, barnstorming and begging for support amongst the population for this treaty and for this international forum. What did it do to him? At some point, on the way back to Washington, after speaking on the West Coast, he had a horrific stroke and spent the rest of his presidency in the basement of the White House that had been turned into basically a hospital room. And his wife, Edith, actually ran, or it was Elizabeth, it was the second wife, ran the government. In those days, it was not so easy to get this information because the press was not as, didn't permeate every nook and cranny of Washington and every aspect of a person's private life. But she was running the government, and he did not live to see his dream come true. The League of Nations did emerge, and ironically, Germany was one of the first nations to join it, but it had a limited life expectancy, but then gave rise to the United Nations, its successor, which is still there today in Manhattan, main branch, and in Geneva, Switzerland, and then there's one other. Where's the one other? I have to think for a moment. But that's what the League of Nations ultimately turned into was the United Nations. So that was the United States' desire and its hope for the future. What were the French aims? The French were brutal. They want, of course, they got Alsace-Lorraine back, but they'd lost 25% of the male population between the ages of 18 and 30, in addition to 400,000 French citizens. So they were basically out for blood, and they wanted all sorts of security arrangements for France under its prime minister, Clemenceau. And again, John Maynard Keynes, the British delegate and economist, said, you're looking for trouble. You're basically putting off you're creating a 20-year armistice. And he was like prophetic. What did he mean? He meant that, yeah, things will be quiet for 20 years and you're going to pay for this with another war. And guess what? There was another war. It was off by a few years, but that's exactly what happened. So the French made all of these demands. The British had suffered also great financial loss, obviously lost to industry and so on and so forth. So they had their calculations. Basically, they wanted money more than land. The land wouldn't have really mattered to the British. They were pretty much protected. But Lloyd George, who was then the Prime Minister of England, actually also opposed the French in the conference in Versailles. He also thought it was draconian, that it was horrible, and that it was going to lead to further problems later on. He believed that a revived, economically viable Germany would benefit England, as I said earlier, and so therefore he, pushed back against the French aims. And now we know what the American plan was, and so on. But a Republican Senate made it very difficult for Wilson, and Wilson was not willing to compromise. Sound familiar? Right. Not willing to compromise. There could have been some sort of an accommodation, but he wanted his way exactly to the word, and he was not willing to give in. So that led to the basically the failure of his plan in the United States. All in all, the end of World War I, which was the end of a bloody, horrific, deadly war, didn't exactly produce the peace and the tranquility that one would have hoped for. If anything, it was a temporary, respite until all of the consequences of that settlement turned into the Second World War, basically, and we know more or less what that involved, and the horror and the death and the suffering and the genocide and everything else that came out of that. We learned that lesson, though, because at the end of World War II, very interesting, at the end of World War II, remember I mentioned Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, first the US ambassador to Constantinople, to the Ottoman Empire, and then the Secretary of the Treasury. So he was a good friend of President Roosevelt. And as World War II came closer to the end, Roosevelt was still alive. He hadn't died yet. Truman had taken over. Basically, Morgenthau was outraged by what the Germans had done in World War II, and he wanted a scorched earth policy. He wanted Germany basically wiped off the map. But cooler heads prevailed, and the realization was that, look what we did in World War I didn't turn out well. We're not going to do that at the end of World War II. We did the end of World War II was the Allies occupied various zones in Germany to, to effect a transition into a democratic government. That is in the West. The East was Russian, Soviet, it was communist. But in the West, the French, the British, and the Americans had the different zones, but they were only to be temporary. And we aided the German comeback after World War II with the Marshall Plan. We sent the Germans money, and we helped them rebuild their industries and their government, with the hope of turning it into a democratic entity, unlike what had been there the 12 years before under the Nazis. And indeed, with the help and support of the United States, Germany turned into one of the better democratic nations and more stable nation, and rebuilt its way back to really amazing, admirable standing economically, politically, and otherwise amongst the Western nations. So at least we learned that lesson from the end of World War I. But to sum it all up, for all of the suffering, the horror, the death, and all of the veterans who suffered lingering physical, emotional, and other consequences of World War I, the treaty, the main treaty that ended it, that is the Versailles Treaty, really didn't address the problem properly, and only led to further complications moving forward. By the way, the Germans were right in one respect. That guilt clause, paragraph 231, was to a great extent unfair, because, remember, go back to the beginning of the class and the causes. The Germans can be accused of maybe aiding and abetting the Austrians and maybe encouraging the Austrians, but they didn't fire the first shot. I mean, if any country was really most directly responsible, was Austria. It was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And basically, they not only did not suffer really the consequences of the Versailles Treaty, they had a separate treaty, but all that happened was they were no longer an empire, with the Hungarians being separate and apart, and Austria being a separate entity. True, there were limitations. It couldn't have any alliance with Germany anymore. There were military restrictions and so on, but the Austrians really didn't suffer the full consequences that the Germans did, and they didn't have to sign a guilt clause. So to a certain extent, the Germans were justified in their criticism of this Versailles Treaty. But the war finally ends. It's 1980. By the way, just one other point. And it was made actually in that documentary. What the Germans wanted was an armistice. And the French and the British said, no. We also said, no armistice. There's going to be a declaration of defeat and a treaty that's going to be signed. What's the difference? An armistice is only temporary. An armistice means you're laying down your arms, you're laying down your weapons, whatever, but that's not the end of the war. And so what the Germans thought is they could ask for an armistice, and in the meantime rebuild or rearrange their troops, and get everything back, do some sort of a, reorganization, and then carry on where they left off. That wasn't going to happen. It's over. And if you don't sign on the dotted line, as the Allies said, we're back on the battlefield tomorrow morning. So really not much of a choice in that respect. So that's how the war ends. Now, again, for those who came in late, on Tuesday when we meet again, I'm going to be posting a short story, because now we're going to literature, called Stories as Told by the Schoolmaster, written by a guy by the name of John Goldsworthy. Very, very important modern British writer. You might be familiar with the Forsyte Saga, trilogy of novels that he wrote that was actually made into made-for-TV movie a few years ago. brilliant writer, very interesting figure, but a very, very interesting story. It's a short story. It's fiction, but it's historical fiction. While this particular event didn't happen to this particular person in this particular way, it was typical of the experiences of many young soldiers. And the point of the story, I'm going to give it away. I hope you'll read it before Tuesday. The point of the story is very profound and again reflects a really interesting aspect of the war as well. So that's going to be for Tuesday. That'll be the Galsworthy short story. I'm going to go on to the great American World War I novel, A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, and then we'll see the movie version of it. Then we'll go to the most famous World War I novel, German writer, Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, probably the most famous anti-war novel ever written. Then we'll see the movie version of it. And then the last novel we'll look at is Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel. Very different from the other two because it's very much in favor of war. He was quite a militarist, Junger, so it's a different perspective. Then we're going to look at some poems. The greatest poems of World War I were written by British poets, because virtually every one of them was a veteran of World War I. But I'm going to include one poem by a German. You'll see why. Very interesting, very tragic poem. And then from there, we're going to go on to the art. Get a packet. I'll post a packet of examples of World War I related art. Also very interesting. And that will then bring us to the end. So any questions about the Versailles Treaty, about the 14 points? Okay, again, the 14 points are posted on Blackboard. So have a great weekend. Stay safe. See you Tuesday. Be well. Any questions? Okay, see you Tuesday.